we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those of you that might not know me yet, I'm Abby Blackburn. I'm the director at the Vermont Ski and Snowboard Museum. This virtual format is still fairly new to us, but we didn't want the current situation to keep us from bringing you the Red Bench Speaker Series or the Writers on the Red Bench, which is the new component of the series. And I also want to thank our longtime sponsors of the Red Bench Speaker Series and now Writers on the Red Bench, Sisler Builders and Vermont Ski and Ride. And before I hand this over to Brian and Maurice, I want to touch upon a few things, kind of some museum housekeeping stuff. So first, the Vermont Ski and Snowboard Museum is a nonprofit organization, and like most nonprofits and small businesses right now, we are experiencing some struggles. We've made this virtual series complimentary, but we do hope that if you have the ability, you decide to make a donation to support our work. We've suggested a $10 donation, which was the admission cost of these in-person events in what feels like a lifetime ago. And with that said, I will be raffling off 2 pairs of Darn Tough socks, and your entry into the raffle is your $10 donation. And if you donate 20, you receive 2 entries, 30, 3 entries, and so on. The winner gets to choose their pair of socks, a pair of men's large snow socks or women's medium vertical socks. The women's black and purple, and the men's black and gray and white. And I will draw and notify those winners tomorrow morning to give you time to make your donations after the event. And at some point during this, when I'm not doing so much talking, I will type in our donation link in the chat, but it's just our normal donation page on our website as well. We are also a member-supported organization. Membership benefits include savings at Vermont ski areas, touring centers, golf courses, retailers, lodging properties. You also get 15% off on shop purchases, and most membership levels receive free admission to over 1,000 museums across the country. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can go to our website for a full list of benefits, or feel free to give us a call. If you'd like to visit us, we are open Fridays and Saturdays from noon to 5. Here you can view our 10th Mountain Division exhibit in person. You can also visit our shop full of winter-themed items, including a 10th Mountain patch and pin, both $6. And Maurice's book, The Winter Army, we will have early next week, and you can pick that up or order it as well. So if you're unable to visit us, we do take orders over the phone and ship orders. We can do that now. The easiest way to do that is just to email info@vtssm.org, and you'll likely get a call back from yours truly. It's a little bit old school, but we are working on getting an online shop for the holiday season. All right, we have a great presentation planned for you tonight, so we'll get started. I'm going to shortly hand this over to Brian Linder, who will be facilitating the discussion, and he'll do the honor of introducing our guest speaker of the evening. Many of you may already know Brian. He's a Vermont native and has been a member of the Mount Mansfield Ski Patrol for 47 years. A fun and very interesting fact about Brian is that until the age of 10, his bedroom is where the ski patrol room is today in the Mansfield Base Lodge. And a couple other things real quick. When we get into a screen share, you're going to see like a row or a column of our faces that might get in the way for you. On the top of that are some little boxes, and you can switch that to speaker view that kind of collapses the rest of us, and it might just be easier for you to actually see and enjoy that presentation. So you can do that on your end. The other thing is, if you do have questions, we're going to get to questions at the end of the presentation, you can type them into the Q&A section. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A, type your question there, we will get it. There's also the chat, I'll monitor that as well, but try to put the questions in Q&A, so we kind of have one central place to look. And without further ado, I hand this off to Brian.
Great, thank you, Abby. So welcome everybody. I think this is a great presentation tonight, and how this came to be was My dad and uncles were in the 10th Mountain Division, so I've always had an interest in it. I think I've read most of the books on the 10th, America's Ski Troops, and I haven't read a bad book yet. But when I read this book, I was really impressed. I was just absolutely captured with the information. I learned so much about the 10th Mountain Division, and it's presented in such a wonderful, readable format. And it did two things for me. I enjoy reading military history from the foxhole level, from the individual soldier's level. I'm not particularly excited about the overall strategies of the entire campaign. But in this book, both are combined together in what I felt was just such a readable and understandable format that I understood, or I think I understand way better now, how the ski trooper in the foxhole felt about the decisions made at the higher level. So when I got done reading the book, I reached out to the author and sent him my thank you and congratulations on such a wonderful book. And we exchanged several emails, and I suggested at the museum might want to have him come in and give us a talk, and he readily agreed to that. So here we are tonight. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Maurice Isserman, the author of The Winter Army. He's a professor of American history at Hamilton College, and he has a presentation he's prepared for us, which I would like to ask him to go ahead and start that now, and then we'll do I'll have some questions at the end, and then we'll open it up for the question and answers from the audience. So with that, Maurice, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for the generous introduction, Brian. And some of Brian's emails where he's telling me about his father's role and his uncles and other 10th Mountain veterans is going to appear in an afterword to the paperback edition of Winter Army, which will come out in November. I got some wonderful emails telling me stories I hadn't heard before from a lot of 10th Mountain descendants, and I wanted to share them with readers. Anyway, let's see the next slide, please. This man is Don Potter, who for many years was my colleague at Hamilton College. We're in upstate New York, not far from the museum. Don was born in Utica. He was raised in Saranac Lake, where he learned how to ski. He went to Williams College and was on the ski team. And in the spring of 1943, he dropped out to join this new founded unit, what became the 10th Mountain Division, and began his training at Camp Hale, rather, in Colorado in the Rockies. Later went to Fort Benning, where he went to officer candidate school, and arrived in Italy with the 10th to take part in the battles of the spring of 1945. He was wounded. He received a Bronze Star for heroism, and he returned in early August with the rest of the division, and 2 weeks later married his high school sweetheart, Jane Chappell, who I also knew, up at Saranac Lake. And I think it's a wonderful photo that the Potter family, who still live around here, shared with me. And Don would tell me about the 10th. I was not writing about military history then. I wasn't writing about mountains then, as I later would. But I got interested. He never talked about the combat. I never learned about his Bronze Star from him. But he would tell stories about training in the Rockies. And then immediately after the war, he made his way to Chamonix in the French Alps, and he climbed Mont Blanc and skied down the mountain. And I was just entranced with this idea of these skiing soldiers who managed to combine their love of skiing and their love of mountains with a very important role in the Second World War. And so he is one of two 10th Mountain veterans to whom the book is dedicated. He was skiing up until the age of 95, 5 years ago in January. He took a fall and died a week or so later. But it was 10th Mountain veterans were a hardy bunch, and as we'll see, they played a significant role in wartime and in peacetime, and in connection with the post-war ski industry as well. So could we have the next slide? Well, those of you of a certain age, mine, will remember this character, John Wayne, in a host of roles. But one that was my favorite, it came out in 1962 when I was 11 years old, was The Longest Day, this kind of epic portrayal of the invasion of Normandy from the air and the sea by the Allies, June 5th, 6th, 1944, from the perspective of the Americans and the British and the Free French and also the Germans. And I probably sat through it 2 or 3 times when it was first released, and then later years watched it over and over again. And it's kind of a pageant more than a war movie, and it's pretty unrealistic. It's not Saving Private Ryan. But I found it thrilling at the time, and particularly John Wayne's role as a lieutenant colonel in the 82nd Airborne, whose men capture Saint-Mère-Église, a crucial crossroads town. And in the course of the movie, he on 2 separate occasions says, "Hit the dirt, men." And in later, after when going out into the woods to play war, World War II, which was a big playtime activity for boys of a certain age in the 50s and the 60s, I would always be telling my men to hit the dirt. This was not actually a very good introduction to the reality of combat. I've written 2 other books about mountaineering, one of them about Himalayan mountaineering, one of them called Fallen Giants, one of them about North American mountaineering called Continental Divide. And even though I was writing about people who accomplished things I never could accomplish at altitudes I never have been at, Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsold, who climbed the West Ridge of Everest in the first American expedition to Mount Everest in 1963, a really important achievement. And I got to interview and then to get to know as a friend Tom Hornbein. You know, I've never been at 28,000 feet on the side of Mount Everest, but I have been at 14 and 15,000 feet, including on Mont Blanc. And so I can almost imagine what it was like. The climbing I did was not in the same league, but I had the moves down. And as I described their moves, I could inhabit their character. I could move into the experience. I could make that leap of historical imagination, which we try to do as historians, into their experience. But writing my first work of military history, that was much more difficult. I was never a soldier. No one's ever shot at me. I've never shot at anyone else. And one day I found myself writing a sentence about what was going on, and the soldiers in the 10th are coming under fire, and I said, "They hit the dirt." And then I said, "Now, wait a minute, Maurice, are you just channeling your inner John Wayne, your inner 11-year-old warrior self?" And I went back, and every time I used a cliche like that, I tried to take it out. I also took out the word heavy, unless I was describing something that was physically heavy, like the 90-pound packs they used to train with on skis. Because heavy, when it's applied to heavy shelling, heavy combat, heavy casualties, really obscures more than it reveals. I wanted to find a language that was true to this experience, which I hadn't shared in any fashion. And so, next slide, please. Where I found that language was in the letters that the veterans wrote, well, some of them after the war, but many of the letters they wrote while they were still serving, training in Colorado, fighting in Italy, and so forth. And I found them, most of them, in a single archive. It was kind of one-stop shopping in terms of research. And that is the 10th Mountain Archive at the Denver Public Library. And I made 3 separate week-long trips out to the Denver Public Library. Wonderful collection. They have some 700 individual deposits, collections from soldiers who served in the 10th in the Second World War, 20,000 letters all told. I can only read a fraction of them, but I read them carefully, and I got to know some of the soldiers who I didn't meet, but I got to know their voice and I got to know their perspective. One of them was Sergeant Dennis Noonan, who was an older soldier. I think he was in his early 30s. He was kind of acerbic. He was really a critic. I mean, he was a good soldier, but he didn't take any nonsense. And one of the letters he wrote home from Casteldiano, and throughout, forgive my terrible Italian pronunciation, which you see there on the left as it appeared in the spring of 1945 after it was captured by the Americans from the Germans. It's a small village in the northern Apennines in Italy. And as it appeared when I went back 2 summers ago, or this spring of 2018, and it's cleaned up since then. It's a very charming little village. But from Casteldiano, Sergeant Noonan wrote home to his mother and says, thanks to the failure of the press, for some reason the lights have just gone off in here, and to the stupidity of Hollywood, the home front has no real conception of war, and only by soldiers' letters home can the truth be made known. And so I let the soldiers' voices be my guide. Not that I was just quoting them. I was integrating their words into my own words, but I was trying to channel the spirit of these soldiers' letters, this firsthand voice from their training days to the front. Next slide, please. This is very much in its origins a New England story, a New England and upstate New York story. And a key character in the formation of the 10th was a civilian by the name of Charles Minot, or Minnie, Dole, who was a Greenwich, Connecticut insurance executive. He'd gone to Phillips Andover prep school. He'd gone to Yale. He'd sung with the Whiffenpoofs. He was kind of New England gentry. He fell in love with skiing. First time he tried it up in Lake Placid. I think it was a year or so after the Winter Olympics there, so in the early 1930s. And he was a very organizationally minded guy, and he saw the need soon. A good friend of his actually died in a skiing accident, for a national ski patrol, volunteer skiers who could keep an eye on the skiers at the spreading number of resorts, ski resorts across the country in New England and upstate New York, and further west in Idaho and Colorado, and Pacific Northwest, California. Skiing was really in its infancy as a mass participation sport. It was largely a sport for the well-to-do. It was expensive to outfit yourself, expensive to, in the midst of the Great Depression anyway, to get to ski resorts, stay at ski resorts. So he had already made his mark as the founder and president of the National Ski Patrol. And one day in Manchester, Vermont, at the Orvis Inn, he was sitting around with a group of friends, 3 or 4 friends. He'd been out skiing all day. This was the winter spring of 1940. The war in Europe had begun in September 1939. There was a related separate war being fought in Finland between the Red Army, the Soviets, and the Finnish troops. And the Finns had deployed ski troops to very good effect against the kind of lumbering columns of the Red Army who were tied to the roads. And the Finns would come skiing in out of the forests and attack and ambush the Red Army. In the end, the Red Army prevailed. They were too great a force. But Minnie and his friends were quite impressed by that. And they also were thinking that the United States was not in the war, was not a belligerent, was in an isolationist mood. But they thought that eventually the United States was going to be drawn into the conflict, inevitably. And they thought, well, what would happen if the Germans landed in Canada? What if they defeated the British, landed in Canada? And of course, that was, at least the defeat of Britain was going to prove to be a very real possibility later in 1940. And what if they came skiing down the Champlain Valley into northern Vermont, into northern New York? What would we counter them with? Because the United States had no tradition of mountain troops, no tradition of ski troops, unlike the Germans, who started off the war with a dozen mountain divisions. The Italians had mountain divisions. The French had mountain divisions, which makes sense because national boundaries in Central Europe are drawn along the ridgelines of the Alps. But the United States had never fought a major battle on a wintry mountain. And most of its bases were in tropical locations, in Hawaii, in Louisiana, in the Philippines, in the Caribbean. And so how was this tropical army going to counter trained, hardened German mountain divisions? And Minnie Dole, being an enterprising guy and also being very self-confident and kind of the same social class as President Franklin Roosevelt, wrote him a letter in the summer of 1940 and said, we should look into this. The War Department should look into this. And he also made the argument that in looking for recruits, you should recruit people who already understood the mountains. They were skiers or mountain climbers or mountain rangers, fur trappers, and others who knew how to conduct themselves outdoors. More reasonable, he said, to make soldiers out of skiers than skiers out of soldiers. And so he actually found an audience in the White House and then in the War Department. And steps were taken in the fall of 1941, while the US was still not a belligerent, but drawing closer to participation, to create an American unit of ski troopers. Next slide, please. And the very first recruit to that unit, which was founded as the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, not yet a division, not yet the 10th Mountain Division, at Fort Lewis near Tacoma, near Mount Rainier in Washington State in November of 1941, was the guy at the microphone with the cigarette, singing directly into the microphone. He was one of the founders of the Glee Club, a tradition that came out of ski clubs, university ski clubs. And he was quite typical of early recruits who found out about the 87th through the National Ski Patrol. The National Ski Patrol didn't simply come up with the idea. They were the primary agency, a civilian agency, identifying and recruiting the early members of the 10th Mountain Division. Anyway, Charles McLean had graduated from Dartmouth the previous spring. He was the captain of the ski team, and his father was a Dartmouth trustee. So he was pretty representative of who skied in those days. And so eager was he to join the 87th that rather than wait to be inducted on the East Coast, he got on a bus with his skis. He brought his own skis, traveled across the country, got off the bus at the gates of Fort Lewis. He had on his big green Dartmouth ski team sweater with the white D on it. And he went up to the somewhat bemused sergeant who was standing there at the gates, and he said, I'm here to join the ski troops. And the sergeant looked back at him and said, son, you are the ski troops, because he was the very first recruit. There were some officers and NCOs, what the Army called cadre, who were transferred into the 87th to handle the initial training, but he was the first guy who really knew how to ski and was kind of the ideal recruit for the 10th. And there you see one of the 10ths, they had a number of kind of bawdy drinking songs, the most famous of which is 90 Pounds of Rucksack, which if you go on YouTube, you can hear the bawdy lyrics. Next slide, please. And so they're at Fort Lewis, but they're quickly transferred to a civilian ski lodge, which the Army has taken over, very luxurious barracks for privates learning the basics. Many of them had individual rooms. They weren't really barracks at all. And the other unusual thing was they immediately began training in their specialty. Rather than going through basic training, learning how to salute, learning how to strip a rifle, and military courtesy, and all the rest of that, they were out on the slopes. I mean, they learned some of the other stuff too, but they were there skiing at about 5,000 feet in Paradise, Washington on Mount Rainier in the winter spring of 1942. Certainly a beautiful place to learn how to ski, or how to learn how to ski in formation, how to be a ski trooper, which is different than civilian skiing. The one thing they couldn't do, which was kind of a disadvantage for a soldier, was they couldn't fire their guns, their rifles, because they're in a national park, and it was illegal to discharge a firearm in a national park. So obviously there was a shortcoming. I learned some of that back at Fort Lewis, but the Army began to build them a camp of their own, realizing that this new unit had its own unique characteristics and its own unique needs in terms of training. Next slide. And so the camp they built was in the Rockies near Leadville, Colorado, in the Eagle Valley at an elevation of 9,200 feet, and surrounded by mountains 14,000 feet high. The two second highest mountains in Colorado are within skiing distance of their camp. And it was designed to be a year-round camp, so they could ski through the winter and then accomplish their other kinds of training, weapons training and so forth, at the low level of 9,200 feet. Now that was a good idea in some ways. It brought them close to their training grounds. It had a few problems. One of which was just in terms of where they would be fighting. There was no place in the world they were going to be fighting at 9,200 feet, let alone 14,000 feet, because ski troops fight to control passes. They don't fight to control mountaintops. And the pass that leads from Italy into Austria, for example, the Brenner Pass, is about 4,500 feet. So it'd be useful to be on skis in the winter, but they were training, they were living at twice that altitude and sometimes training at 3 times that altitude. And that meant a lot of them suffered from altitude sickness, at least in the early weeks. Also, being in a valley surrounded by high mountains protected them from the winds, but it also meant that all of that coal smoke from the locomotives, soft coal that the locomotives were burning in those days, and from the furnaces and stoves in their barracks, coal stoves, all that smoke palled over the camp. It was not blown away. And so they developed various ailments. It was like being in a supremely polluted industrial city. They called it the Pando Hack. They were coughing and they had sore throats, and some of them could never adjust to it, so others got over it. Well, one guy who got over it was, I'm going to be talking a bit about him as we go along, Private John Parker, nicknamed Eagle Compton, who served in the 82nd Regiment, the 2nd Regiment organized in the 10th, what became the 10th Mountain Division. And he, as you can see from the letter, he really loved the experience. He was from an elite background, even more elite than a number of the other people I'll be mentioning, because he had learned to ski in boarding school in Switzerland, and his grandfather was the chief CEO of Ralston Purina, the pet food company. So not everybody was as rich as John Parker Compton, but he loved being a private in the 10th Mountain Division. Next slide. And here again, I won't read his letters, but they went on very rigorous training missions into the high mountains. One of them was called D series. No, go back, Sharon. D series, and for division series. And the entire division in early April 1944 tromped up into the high mountains and were up there. They were supposed to be up there for 3 weeks. There were so many cases of frostbite, and people got lost, and the radios didn't work, and in some ways it was a disaster. It really challenged their stamina. And the joke in Italy, when they were being shelled by the Germans, was, if this gets any worse, it'll be as bad as D series. But even in the midst of this, for some soldiers, quite traumatic couple of weeks of training, there was John Parker Compton, his typical optimism and love of the mountains, talking about the beauty that he observed, being on mountaintops and looking down at the clouds, not looking up. Now, next slide. The other thing that distinguished the 10th Mountain Division, apart from the skis and the mountain climbing training, is that they were a light division. That is to say, their weapons were lighter. They had 30 caliber machine guns instead of the standard infantry 50 caliber machine guns. They had 75 millimeter artillery pieces instead of 105 or 150 millimeter artillery pieces, because it's much harder, of course, to get that heavy gear up into the mountains. And you can't take trucks up into the mountains, and you can only sometimes use Jeeps. They developed their own tracked vehicles called Weasels, which were the precursors to the post-war Snowcats. But they relied on, to a significant extent, on mules. And so they had special mule skinners, many of them recruited from Missouri, who were not mountaineers, but they knew mules. But every soldier in the 10th was supposed to learn how to pack a mule and how to lead a mule. And mules are ornery animals. And again, I won't read Lieutenant Earl Clark's complaints about his weeks being in charge of a mule unit. But the mules were not the favorite part of the 10th Mountain experience. Next slide, please. If you wanted to learn how to ski in 1944, the best place in the world to do it was at Camp Hale in the Colorado Rockies, because you would go out week after week, all days, skiing in the morning, skiing in the afternoon, skiing into the evening, on Cooper Hill, which is still an active civilian ski tow now. And you had the best instructors in the world there. People like Walter Prager, who had been the Swiss-born ski coach at Dartmouth, and Torger Tokel, who was a refugee from Norway, who was the world ski jump champion and had won hundreds of ski jumping championships in his own country and in the United States. And ski jumping was a very popular spectator sport, even if actual skiing was not so popular at the time. And so after a while, they ran out of qualified ski recruits. You know, they pretty much plucked the best of the ski teams from Dartmouth and Williams and University of Oregon and University of Washington and elsewhere. So they began bringing in recruits who had never been skiers, but had been athletes, high school athletes, college wrestlers, or whatever, who were fit. And then the lights come back on. The mysteries will never cease. And trained them. And many of them became very expert skiers and lifelong devotees of the sport. Now, next slide, please. And after skiing all week, what did they do on the weekends? They went skiing, including a number of them would make their way about 75 miles through the mountains to a rundown former mining town called Aspen, which had a ski tow rope and had some pretty spectacular slopes to ski on. And there's the Jerome Hotel, where they liked to stay. And they drank a concoction made of a milkshake and bourbon, I think, called the Aspen Crud. I mean, these were young men, soldiers, but they so loved skiing, their specialty in the military, that they skied when they didn't have to. And one of them who came to Aspen was a Austrian refugee who'd been a ski instructor in Austria, in the Austrian Alps, Friedel Pfeiffer, who arrived there in June of 1943 and was just struck by the potential for Aspen. And he vowed that if he survived the war, he was going to come back and he was going to turn Aspen into the resort it should be. He felt it should be something on the scale of the Austrian ski resorts. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, there's a war going on, and the 10th are not in it, and they're feeling increasingly antsy. A lot of 10th guys, after a year or more training, including Charles McLean, transferred out. He transferred into military intelligence. He figured the Army was never going to use them. But there was a battle going on in Italy where they could have been made good use of, because Italy is not the soft underbelly of Europe, as Winston Churchill called it, but it is rather a very mountainous terrain. through much of the boot. The Allies landed in Sicily from North Africa in July 1943. They crossed over to the Toe and the lower boot at Salerno in September 1943. They capture Naples and they capture Bari, another port on the Adriatic Sea, and that gives them two good ports from which they can control the Mediterranean. And they get airfields like Foggia and Sardinia, from which they can attack southern Germany from the south. So not just flying from England now, but a two-front aerial assault. So that part of the advance up the Italian boot served a real strategic purpose. But wars have their own built-in direction. Once you've landed in Italy, you're going to keep fighting up Italy. And then they hit the mountains, and the first of a number of German defensive lines, and the Germans were really good at building defensive lines, and they ground to a halt. One of the famous places they were halted at on what was known as the Gustav Line was a hilltop monastery called Monte Cassino, and they were stuck there for 5 months. The Allies couldn't get around it. They couldn't get up it. Finally, it was a combination of Polish and French mountain troops who captured it after enormous cost. They could have used the 10th Mountain there, but the 10th was back in Colorado training. In the summer of 1944, they fought through the mountains the Allies came into flatter ground, more open ground around Rome, leading up to Florence, where they could bring to bear their advantage in air power and in armor, and they drove the Germans back, but the Germans just made another defensive line called the Gothic line, this time in the northern Apennines. Could we have the next slide? And here's Bill Malden's famous Willie and Joe cartoon characters, and that phrase, hit the dirt boys, and Willie and Joe looking a little puzzled as they try to get up one of Italy's innumerable mountains to attack the enemy. Next slide. So this might be a little difficult to pick out details, but the blue line is essentially the Allied advance line along the Arno River, so that runs through Florence, which is somewhere on that blue line. And kind of the red line is the German Gothic line through the northern Apennines, running from coast to coast and blocking further advance. And there in the white bit in the center, you see Bologna. When you get to the city of Bologna, which is a pretty important destination, major industrial city, you're in the Po Valley. And the Po Valley is the industrial heartland and also the agricultural breadbasket of Italy. And once again, it's open country. And so Allied air power and Allied armor can make short shrift of the Germans once they're there, but the trick is getting there. So finally, the Pentagon decides that it's time for the 10th Mountain to prove their worth. And in December of 1944 and in January of 1945, they board troop ships, sail to Naples, and are then trucked to the front in the northern Apennines. Next slide. And they're in a place, there's two distinct landmark features. One of them is Riva Ridge, which you see there in the background, and another is the Belvedere Massif, which is made up of three separate mountains linked by saddles. And what is this guy not wearing? He's not wearing skis, because they didn't bring the skis. Somebody in the Army decided they wouldn't need the skis or their nice warm sleeping bags or their other specialized mountain gear. And so they all wound up in a warehouse in Boston. They scrounged some skis and sent out some early patrols up into the hills where the snow was. But they discovered something quickly, which was they were trying to raid enemy outposts, maybe capture a prisoner, and they were skiing up there as they had been trained to do, but they weren't in deep powder snow. Something very strange going on with the lights at Hamilton College tonight. They weren't in deep powder snow. They were, I love Zoom, don't you? They were in corn snow, because, like in northeastern mountains, certainly in the Adirondacks, the snow melts and refreezes and melts and refreezes. And instead of going silently through this deep powder, which you got in the Colorado Rockies, going shh, 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 they were going through corn snow going. So the Germans didn't have to see them to shoot at them. They could just shoot towards the sound of their skis. So they quickly ditched the skis. So the ski troops, the ski instruction was extremely important in making these men very fit and giving them a sense of their elite status as fighting men. But in practice, it didn't prove that useful. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the landscape feature. On the right, you have the Belvedere Massif, comprised of Mount Belvedere, Mount Gorgolesco, and Mount Della Torraccio. Again, I ask indulgence for my terrible Italian. And those three peaks overlook, and you can't see this, but further to the right, if this map was extended, you'd see Highway 64, which was one of two highways running from, essentially from Florence to Bologna, in which the main Allied advance could take place, the tanks and the trucks and all of that stuff. But you couldn't get up through there because the Germans had artillery zeroed in from the mountaintops, from behind the mountains with artillery observers. And so in November 1944, on two occasions, Allied units, American, Brazilian, attacked Mount Belvedere and were beaten off both times. And the reason they were beaten off was because the Germans also had artillery observers on that feature to the left of the little valley there. And that is Riva Ridge. And it wasn't strongly held, but it had a very steep cliff on the, and no obvious trails on the side facing the Allies below. And so the Germans were so confident of their position on Riva Ridge that they didn't bother to mine the cliffs. They didn't put in barbed wire entanglements, both of which they did on Mount Belvedere, where they expected the main attack to come again. And so this guy, Hugh Evans, was in that attack, Hugh Evans in the 85th Regiment, who was another New Englander. He went to, I'm trying to remember all my prep schools, Phillips Exeter. And right out of Phillips Exeter, he went out to Camp Hale, where he proved himself, he got his sergeant stripes. But he's still only 20 years old when this attack is being planned for the night of, actually, they begin to move out on February 18th and the main fighting February 19th and 20th and into the 21st. So this was what they'd been training for all that time. And where the 10th Mountains training paid off was in the rock climbing they had done and the mountain climbing they had done, because they found routes, they scouted out routes up that sheer cliff line and moved up about 750 soldiers on the night of February 18th, 19th. Next slide, please. And there you see the Riva Ridge and the outlines of the trails that they followed to the top. And the amazing thing is that they climbed up, and they're heavily laden. It's the middle of the night. It's the middle of the winter. There's ice. There's icy water pouring down on them. The Germans who were arrayed along the ridgeline never catch on. Nobody drops a weapon or a helmet or falls and screams. And they get up on the top and they're able to overpower the Germans. They've gained the high ground all the way along the ridge at the cost of 1 man wounded. They take no fatalities that first night. And in the morning, when the Germans wake up to what's happening, they're the ones who have to attack the high ground, which they do. The Germans always counterattack. And certainly the fighting went on for 5 days on Riva Ridge, but the Americans, 10th Mountain Troopers, having gained the high ground, were able to hold out. Next slide, please. And there you see another image of Riva Ridge from below, and then some of the men from 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment on the top after they've seized the ridgeline, and they're looking out towards Mount Belvedere. So now they have the high ground and the ability to spot German troop movements and German gun emplacements and batteries and so forth. Next slide, please. And this is what it looked like 2 springs ago when I went there. It's much more heavily wooded now. It was much barer back in 1945. Next slide, please. And then they go on the next night, so that's the 19th to the 20th, to attack Mount Belvedere. And this guy, Marty Daneman, was one of my favorite letter writers and soldiers. He was 18. He just graduated from high school in Chicago. He was not a skier. He'd wrestled in high school. He learned how to ski. And he had a fiancée, Lois, a year younger than him in Chicago, and he just wrote her every day from training. I mean, I've read hundreds of his letters, very charming letters, full of detail. And he even wrote pretty often from Italy. It was much harder, of course, to do so. And he was, in the beginning, January, before they got into heavy combat, there I use the word heavy, he was full of piss and vinegar. He was a kid. He was 19. He hadn't turned 20 yet. And he said, Lois, I can't wait to get into action and test myself and see if I have what it takes and so forth. And then he goes into action on the night of February 19th, 20th, 21st on Mount Belvedere. And he strikes a very different tone in his first letter, which is weeks later. He can't bring himself to write. In one short period of time, I learned to hate as I never thought I could. I saw enough blood and torn flesh and death to last forever. Came close to being killed himself. But I came out of it whole, and we did it. 4 outfits tried it before, and we did it. So he has pride, but he also has a new kind of realism, a new kind of maturity. He said in another letter written about at the same time, he turned 20 during the fight for Belvedere. It was his 20th birthday, and he felt like he was 30, which to me doesn't sound that old, but for a 20-year-old sounds like a really old man. So he did a lot of growing up in a hurry. Next slide, please. And that's what Mount Belvedere looks like today. It's a very gentle mountain. It's about the same height as Mount Monadnock. But of course, Mount Monadnock, when you climb it, is not occupied by hostile troops and with minefields and machine guns zeroed in on the likely gullies and so forth. Next slide. John Parker Compton. So they capture Belvedere, they capture Riva Ridge, Gorgolesco, Mount Delatoraccio. There are several hundred killed in 5 days, but the army had thought it was going to take them 2 weeks and might have been thousands killed. So they seize their objective, have a few days lull, and then in March they push off again further into the mountains. And on March the 3rd, 1945, PFC John Parker Eagle Compton is killed in action. And I just want to read a passage from Winter Army. In the spring of 1945, the bodies of the 10th Mountain soldiers killed in Italy were buried in a cemetery located some 25 miles southwest of Florence. After the war, American families who had lost soldiers abroad could have the bodies brought back to the United States for reburial, or could leave them in military cemeteries in the countries in which they died. In 1959, the Florence American Cemetery and Memorial was completed just south of the city of Florence. Its 70 acres are the final resting place for 4,402 U.S. servicemen killed in Italy. Of those, 326 died while serving in the 10th Mountain Division. Private First Class John Parker Compton, G Company 86th, who died on March 3rd, 1945, is one of those troopers buried in the Florence Cemetery. And there you see his cross, which I found when I visited the cemetery at the end of my stay. About 9 months before and the other photo is of a plaque on a church in Eola. Eola was pretty much destroyed, like many of the villages, and John Parker Compton's family helped rebuild the church, and they the villagers put a plaque to remember Compton on the side of the church. About 9 months before his death in June 1944, as the 10th prepared to ship out from Camp Hale to Camp Swift in Texas, where they were briefly stationed, Compton wrote his parents expressing regrets at having to leave the Colorado Rockies behind. I looked up at the mountains this afternoon as I was crossing Eagle River. The sun seemed to intensify the green of the firs and the aspen foliage. I'll always remember that panorama. I felt the vastness and majesty of the feeling one gets after traveling days and days on the ocean without sight of land." End quote. What parents reading a letter like that from their 21-year-old son wouldn't be touched? What a fine young man he's become, they might think with justifiable pride. One can also imagine Compton's parents rereading the same letter a year later and wondering if their boy might have had a premonition that day at Camp Hale that he would not be returning to the Colorado mountains. Next slide, please. So they push out of the mountains and into the Po Valley, where it opens up, as you can see, heading towards the Po River. Their job is done, you'd think. But they are such hard chargers that they remain in the vanguard of the Allied advance all the way through the Po Valley and up into the foothills of the Alps. They're not trained for this kind of fighting. They make an amphibious assault across the Po River. There you see a day or so later a pontoon bridge going across so that you can get jeeps and tanks and trucks across. But the mountain troopers are suddenly paddling little boats. They don't have life preservers, but they get across, they seize the opposite bank. Next slide. And they reach Lake Garda, a beautiful resort lake, and push up its eastern shore, fiercely defended by the Germans, and seizing Riva del Garda, the town there on the upper left-hand side, which you can see controls the highway, which the Germans, were they to evacuate to the Brenner Pass, take their troops out of Italy into Austria, then part of Nazi Germany, would need to travel. And so they put the stopper in the bottle. They were again the sharp end of the stick. They were never given an objective that they didn't capture, and they were never thrown off an objective once they had captured it. It's really an extraordinary story. And these were green troops. They hadn't been in combat until February. This is April, late April. But they learned on the ground, and they were, again, superbly trained. Next slide, please. And they began, like soldiers everywhere, they began picking up souvenirs, Lugers and the like. And one lucky group got sent to occupy Mussolini's villa. Mussolini had been thrown out of power, but restored to a puppet fascist state in northern Italy, and made his headquarters at his villa on Lake Garda on the western shore of the lake. And a group of 10th Mountain Troopers crossed the lake in an Army Duck vehicle and loaded up on souvenirs from Mussolini's closet, all of those hats. They also found his convertible, which they enjoyed riding 90 miles an hour up and down the road on the western shore of Lake Garda. Next slide, please. And so there they go. There's their 150-mile advance, breaking the stalemate, breaking through the German lines and spearheading the Allied advance from the mountains to the Alps, from the Apennines to the Alps. Next slide, please. For which they paid a significant price. This is back Cooper Hill, above Camp Hale, Tennessee Pass. And this memorial stands, I visited it on one of my visits to Colorado, listing 995 10th Mountain soldiers who gave their lives in Italy, and 4,000 more who were wounded. And so that's 5,000 men, and a division is slightly less than 15,000. So 1/3 of the division. That included some replacement soldiers. It wasn't all the original 10th Mountain veterans. Bob Dole, for example, the Republican senator from Kansas who'd never been on a mountain before he was assigned as a second lieutenant to lead a platoon of the 10th Mountain as a replacement officer in February of 1945, and he was very badly injured in the April offensive, the final offensive. But he was one of those 4,000 10th Mountain troopers who were also casualties, not killed. Next slide, please. And then they came home, and they fully expected to go to Japan. They were going to get a month off of leave, and they were going to start training back at Camp Hale for the invasion of Japan, which looked to be every bit as bad or worse than the fighting they'd already done. And they were one of the troop ships they were on, sailed into New York Harbor on August 6th, 1945, which was Hiroshima Day. And it was their first inkling that they were indeed going to be able to outlive the war and go back to civilian life. And one of those who did so was my old favorite Marty Daneman, writing in April 1945, the heaviest fighting is still to come, but optimistically saying, you know, when I get home, let's get married right away. Our love has been proved 1,000 times. It can't be said that we're too young anymore. He's 20, she's 19, but you know, certainly he did do some growing up. I want to be with you every moment of my life, dearest, and never have to wait. And so he comes back, and 6 weeks, no, actually, I'm sorry, 2 weeks after getting back to the United States in mid-August 1945, he and Lois are married, and that's their wedding photo provided to me by Marty and Lois's sons. They had 4 sons. They stayed together for the rest of their life, and Marty died just 5 years ago. So another long-lived veteran of the 10th Mountain Division. Next slide, please. So in the post-war era, the veterans of the 10th were at the forefront of developing skiing into a mass participation sport, turning it not quite as an elite sport as it had been, developing old resorts, which got started but weren't much to look at, like Aspen, and completely new resorts like Vale that Pete Seibert and some other 10th vets founded. He had been in Aspen before that in the late 1950s. And the main ski run, and the most difficult, that yellow line running down the center of Vale Mountain, is called Riva Ridge. And there's another one, you can't really see it here, but called Minnie's Mile. And there in the center of Vale is the statue of a World War II ski trooper. So some 2,000 veterans of the 10th went into the ski industry as instructors. They published ski magazines. They developed retail ski sales. Others, like David Brower, became director of the Sierra Club and greatly expanded the Sierra Club from a regional California organization to the leading national environmental organization, invented the Sierra Club calendars and the big Sierra Club picture books. David Browerman, I can't remember Browerman's first name, but he founded Nike shoes. I mean, these guys were a talented bunch of guys. And they carried their esprit, their self-confidence into the civilian world, and had a major impact in all kinds of fields. Next slide, please. And final slide, actually. So I have to get myself into the picture. This is my trip to the Northern Apennines. In the upper left, I'm standing on Riva Ridge, and on the upper right, I'm in a German bunker, much filled in, but you can still tell what it was, on Belvedere, and one of the little town squares in Querciola, which was the village right below Mount Belvedere, from which the main American assault, 10th Mountain Assault on Belvedere took place. And I just want to read the final paragraph from Winter Army. Along Riva Ridge and the ridgeline connecting Belvedere, Gorgolesco, and Della Terraccia, today there aren't many reminders that a great and terrible battle was fought there within living memory. A few memorials, a few markers, some shallow depressions in the earth that were once bunkers or foxholes. The barren mountainsides of 1945 are now heavily wooded. In the springtime, the hills are dark green, except where the canopy of leaves is embroidered by flowering chestnut trees. Visible on the lower hills, the little towns like Querciola and Viciciatico are bigger now and prosperous. The time of hunger, rubble, and violent death, long gone if not forgotten. There is a Piazza 10th Mountain Division on a quiet side street in Querciola that invites appreciative reflection in the shadow of Belvedere. The views from Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere today are of a beautiful and peaceable landscape in an imperfect but better world. The men of the 10th helped to make it so. Sempre avanti, or that became their motto, sempre avanti, or always forward in Italian. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions and Brian's questions and comments. Take it away, Brian.
Well, thank you. That was really an excellent summary. You've covered all the points I was going to ask originally very nicely. But a couple of things. Vermont had 6 Vermonters that were killed in action. Almost every state that I can think of had men in the 10th Mountain Division. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the 10th's experience in Alaska and Texas specifically.
Yeah, their experience in both, for different reasons, were not quite so exhilarating as some of the other experiences. They were sent, the 87th was sent to Alaska in 1943 to recapture a island in the Bering Strait called Kiska. Japanese had occupied around the time of the Battle of Midway in 1942, 2 islands which were American territory, but of course pretty barren and of no great strategic importance. But it seemed intolerable to the authorities that they should be on American soil. And so the Army sent in a regular flatland unit, and I forget which one it was, to recapture Attu, and they really weren't outfitted for it or trained for it. It was cold, this is Bering Strait. Many of them suffered from frostbite and so forth, and they took pretty heavy casualties. And so somebody noticed they had this thing called the 10th Mountain Division, and it wasn't so much they'd be fighting in mountains, but they certainly would be fighting in the cold if you go up to the Bering Strait. And so the 87th was dispatched along with some other units, Canadian units, some Ranger units, to capture Kiska, and they landed there. I think this was August of 1943. And met no resistance at all on the beachfront, but sometimes the Japanese withdrew into the interior. So they made their way up. This is a volcanic island up the slope, not very steep slope, but to the high ground. And then this being the place in the world with the worst weather imaginable, the clouds roll in, the fog rolls in, it gets dark. Somebody discharges a gun. Somebody sees something moving in the shadows and fires, and suddenly there's a huge firefight going on. These men are barely dug in on this gravelly basalt, I guess it would be volcanic soil. Men are dying, men are being wounded. And in the morning, when the sun rises and the clouds lift and the fog disperses, there are 24 dead Americans and Canadians, of whom I think 18 or 19 were 10th Mountain guys, and many more wounded. And there were no Japanese dead, and they quickly figured out that the Japanese had pulled out right under the eyes of the Air Force and the Navy. They somehow loaded all their several thousand men on submarines and other vessels and gotten them off the island before the Americans got there. So it was a tragic and in some ways, the 87th felt farcical way to be introduced to combat, and they wrote a very bitter song about it. I mean, it was a comic song, but it was no Japs at all. No Japs at all. I mean, they used the racial slur, of course, this being World War II, but we went in and there were no Japs at all. And then Texas, I don't know what the Army was thinking. It's a little unclear, but here they are. The 10th is training in Colorado, and nobody wants them. But somebody gets the idea, why don't we shift them to Camp Swift? Well, Camp Swift is in Texas near Austin. And just as, many men were felled by going up to high altitude at the start of their training and suffering from all of the other ills that you got in the little town of Pando in the Eagle Valley, the Pando Hack. So these men get on the train in Colorado in June of 1944 in their wool uniforms. At 9,200 feet, it's still pretty cold. And they get off the train 2 days later in 100-degree Texas heat, and they march a mile to their barracks at Camp Swift, which is a major military base, and they're dropping by the score. They're just dropping of heat exhaustion. And their training, they did a lot of their training at night because it was so hot during the day, and they're trained to use heavier weapons. So they get some of those 50 caliber machine guns instead of the 30 calibers. They get 105 millimeter artillery instead of the 75s they've been training with. And their fear is, and it's not entirely clear what the Army was thinking, their fear was they were going to be converted into a regular flatland unit and just sent to Europe to fight, or sent to the Pacific to fight, not on a mountain setting. But finally the Army figured out what they would be best at and pulled them out of Texas and sent them off to Italy.
Okay. My uncle, Leo Bartlett, was one of the early members of the 87th, and he was on a team that was doing a lot of testing of equipment.
Right.
And he mentioned to me a couple of different things that I've always remembered. He said, we were trying to figure out what kind of socks to wear. And he said, we did a lot of experimenting with snowshoes. We had to figure out what size, what design of snowshoes a soldier needed to have to carry all of his gear. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the equipment. You mentioned the weasel, the Studebaker weasel, but a little bit more about the equipment.
Yeah, when the Army first started training ski troops, before the founding of the 87th, they sent them out in heavy winter coats. So these are heavy wool coats that go down to their knees. And you can imagine after you're not a very good skier and you've fallen on your backside a few times, those heavy coats are even heavier. They're, encrusted in snow and ice. And they figured out after a while that was not a good idea. So they developed lighter, warmer, more practical ski clothing that was reversible, so you could have a white exterior or a camouflage exterior, depending on whether you were in snow or not. They developed better skis, better control and direction, better bindings. A lot of the ski gear that was used immediately after the war was surplus because they didn't take it to Italy. So the Army dumped it on the civilian market. They developed special ski boots, which were particularly interesting because they were a combination of Vibram-soled mountain boots. Vibram was a brand new idea. The Italians had developed it. But also, could be clipped into a ski binding at the same time. It meant to do double duty. And they had, warmer sleeping bags. When they got to Italy, the warm sleeping bags were back in Boston, and they were issued first 2 woolen blankets and then 4 woolen blankets, and they were still shivering all night and cursing the Quartermaster Corps for stiffing them of their wonderful mountain equipment.
We have several questions from the audience. The first one was, were there any memorable Vermonters in the 10th Mountain? From my own standpoint, the Von Trapps come immediately to mind as serving.
Others, yeah. That one stymies me. I mean, I'm sure there were many.
Yep.
I don't actually know the answer to that. I will say something about Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and upstate New York, which is outside of Colorado. This is the region that most identifies with the 10th Mountain Division. If you think about the airborne divisions, there were no airborne divisions in 1940, and the 101st, the 82nd were created. Most Americans can identify World War II airborne division, well, many Americans can, certainly the 101st, thanks to Band of Brothers. But I don't think outside of our 2 regions, Colorado and the Northeast, the North Country, the 10th is not that well remembered. There are memorials here, as there are in Colorado. In Colorado, this is almost makes it worth moving to Colorado. You can get a Colorado state license plate that says the Spirit of the 10th. I would love to have one of those. Several museums dedicated to the memory of the 10th, and so forth. And also in upstate New York, not far from where I'm sitting now, at Camp Drum, the reconstituted 10th Mountain Division Light Infantry, that's their base. The 10th was disbanded in November 1945. There were various units that were trained in mountain warfare technique, but never on a division scale. But the 10th was recreated in 1985, and since then they have been the most deployed unit in the American Army, and which makes sense if you think about where the American Army has been fighting in places like Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. So many veterans of the 10th have done 2, 3, many deployments. Fortunately, my book came out in November, so I was able to go out to Colorado for a week. I was able to do, for book events, I was able to do a number in upstate New York, and one I was particularly pleased with was at Fort Drum. I was invited to give a talk there to young men and women in uniform who had just gotten their deployment orders for Afghanistan. They were going back, some of them, again, after serving multiple deployments there before. So as I was reading, some of the soldiers' letters describing the blood and the gore and their feelings of fighting in Italy, I was thinking, this is not my usual audience. It's not a casual audience of students or people interested in military history. This is people for whom this is real.
We have a question from William that you had actually touched in our conversation on Monday, and that was, did the battles that the 10th Mountain Division fight, with the benefit of hindsight, did they really have to fight?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And with the benefit of hindsight, did the war in Italy really have to go on once you'd secured Naples, Bari, Sardinia, and Foggia? Because then you controlled the Mediterranean. And you tied down tens of thousands of German troops. They couldn't pull out of Italy and let you go up to the Brenner Pass. So even without losing further soldiers, the first part of the fighting in Italy made sense in a strategic sense. Thereafter, it was more momentum. General Mark Clark was a famous egoist. He really wanted to get to Rome, and he actually let a good portion of the German army escape to fight another day when he was occupying Rome, which was, was very symbolic and dramatic. Pictures of American soldiers marching past the Colosseum, but it wasn't strategically important. So you could have halted the advance there, because the Germans still had to keep tens of thousands of soldiers who couldn't be used in fighting against either the Red Army advancing from the east, or after June 6th, against the Allies advancing from the west. When the 10th reached Italy in January of 1945, the Red Army was within 50 or 60 miles of Berlin, and they were driving steadily on. And the Americans and the British and the Canadians had been pushed back in the Battle of the Bulge, but now they had reoccupied the Bulge. And in early March, they crossed the Rhine River and at Remagen and several other places, and they were driving into central Germany. So you had a classic vice maneuver. The Germans were being pressed on two fronts, and the war is going to be decided in Berlin. It's going to be decided in central Germany. And even if not a single other soldier, American or German, had died in Italy, it wouldn't have made any difference. The war still would have ended when it ended. But again, wars have their own momentum, and there was a fear among Allied intelligence, especially American intelligence, that the Germans intended to fight on after the fall of Berlin, that they'd fly Hitler out to Berchtesgaden in the Austrian Alps, that they were withdrawing, elite units there, SS units, and storing up supplies for an Alpine redoubt, it was called. It was all mythical. And some of it was disinformation. But you had to go with the information you had, and in which case it would be very useful to keep that 250,000 German soldiers in Italy, stuck in Italy, by keeping them from withdrawing through the Brenner Pass.
Yep.
So, with the strength of hindsight, and I'm not a military strategist, it seems like a lot of the sacrifice was for naught. But going back into the moment, you couldn't be 100% sure.
Okay. We have a comment from Jennifer. First of all, she says, "Thank you for this talk, Professor." And she's the head of the Vermont Academy, where Roger Emerson attended. Roger was a victim of the friendly fire in the Aleutians. And she wanted to thank you for the talk, but it's kind of ironic because yesterday I delivered a copy of my file on Roger Emerson to the New England Ski Museum. I had significant information that they didn't have about him being killed. In the file that I delivered, there were several letters, which apparently Jennifer's also read, with his parents, the agony that the parents went through after all of this happened. Another attendee asked, did any 10th veterans start ski equipment companies that we'd still recognize today?
Yes, well, outdoor equipment.
Outdoor equipment.
Jerry Cunningham, who opened a ski shop in Utica, actually close by where I am, moved it out to Denver. Not a retail shop at first. He opened his first retail shop, Jerry Outdoor Gear, in Boulder in 1958. But he was really a pioneer in the field. And a number of 10th veterans, they didn't start businesses exactly, but they bought up surplus gear because prior to World War II, mountain gear, crampons and carabiners and pitons were largely manufactured in Europe. A lot of them manufactured in Germany. And so they used European stuff, and now they had their own carabiners and their own crampons and their own pitons, which actually weren't as good as the European ones. They got better in the 1950s. But they bought them up and just sold them through the Sierra Club or through other outdoor mountain clubs, the AMC and the Mazamas and so forth. So yeah, 10th guys were really significant in that. Headfees, I think, was started by or directed by a 10th veteran.
Okay, we have a question. I remember my dad telling me, because I inherited his 10th Mountain backpack that he somehow or rather managed to bring home. And I remember him telling me once that when they went out on the D series, they did everything they possibly could to get that 90-pound rucksack down light as possible. So we cut our shoelaces in half. We broke matches in half. What else was in the 90-pound rucksack?
Well, they had to carry food. They had to carry water. They they had tents, which were terrible. They just didn't let any moisture out. So they much preferred to build igloos or dig, depressions in the snow. But they would spread the tents out over their igloos. They had their weapons. They had ammunition, radios. They couldn't depend upon the mules. The mules would head up and they'd get up to their withers in deep powder snow, and they weren't going to go any further. So they had to carry things that the mules should have been carrying, or a Jeep should have been carrying. So there was a lot to keep track of.
Okay. Yep. Jim sent in a question. That I sort of alluded to at the beginning, but you could elaborate on it far better than I. And the Allied general leadership in Italy has been much aligned over the years. Were you able to get an idea as to how the 10th veterans in the foxholes felt about the campaign itself?
Well, I quote a number of letters where before they go into their first serious assault, Riva Ridge and Belvedere, where they actually say, the Russians are going to be in Berlin in 2 weeks. I hope that the brass figure this out. And one of them wrote, go Ruskies, go. They didn't care who got into Berlin first. It wasn't that they were, shirking their duty, but they sort of saw the strategic logic of the way the war was really going to end. Once the fighting began, once they were taking casualties. You didn't hear that anymore. They were too close to it to question the necessity of it. And after the war was over, I didn't see anybody making that point. I mean, they'd made the sacrifice. They wanted the sacrifice to be meaningful, and it was meaningful. But it might not have been necessary. And the leadership, they loved their own leaders. They loved Major General Hayes and the colonels who commanded their regiments. And there were some very talented generals in that theater, like Lucian Truscott, who commanded Fifth Army after Mark Clark became the overall Allied commander in Italy. But Truscott hated Mark Clark, and he thought he was, just showing off and wasting his men's lives. And his memoir about that campaign is scathing when it comes to Clark.
Okay. Jennifer had asked for a copy of my Roger Emerson file. And Jennifer, if you're still on, if you would just shoot an email to Abby at the Ski Museum with your contact info, I'll be happy to make a copy and send that down for the Academy files. Carl had a question. Can you name any veterans from Vermont who made substantial contributions to skiing development in Vermont, or were mentioned in the book? And maybe I can elaborate a little bit myself on that. At Stowe, we have a list of 16 men who are veterans of the 10th Mountain that served at Stowe, and ski school director, ski patrol director, mountain manager, and perhaps you could speak to that, their influence post-war.
Yeah, I can't speak. I know they were important at Stowe,
Yep.
And at other northeastern ski resorts that were either being expanded or developed. I really kind of paid more attention to the western resorts.
Okay. Do you think that was the typical experience of ski resorts after the war, that they were heavily staffed with 10th Mountain?
Absolutely. Again, 2,000 of them went into the ski industry, and well, you learned to ski from 10th veterans, and
Yep.
How many of the next generation of skiers had that kind of direct contact in the 50s.
Yep. Okay. We have a comment from Martha. Hi, Martha. How you doing tonight? Appreciate the talk tonight. And I mentioned my dad was in the 87th M Company and came back after the war and opened the first ski shop in Connecticut called the Veterans Ski Shop, which I think, again, I remember several veterans starting ski shops. I don't think that was unusual, but I love the name, Veteran Ski Shop.
Right.
Okay. I don't think we have any other open questions. Oh, Abby, did you want to mention that? Answer that? Nope. Okay, we don't have any more open questions at this time. I guess in closing, I would like to say, before I turn it back to Abby, that again, highly recommend your book. I'm so impressed. It was such a readable thing. I learned so much about the 10th, despite growing up, knowing what I thought so much about the 10th. I learned so much more from your book, and I think it's wonderful. And you're to be congratulated for it.
Thank you. I'm just pleased to have an opportunity to talk about the 10th. I thought I would be doing book events all through the spring, but something else got in the way.
Okay. One other comment just came in from Sepp Scanlon over at Fort Drum, and he said the Veteran Ski Shop actually used the Pando Commando as their insignia. So there's a neat little piece of trivia for you.
Yeah, Sepp invited me to Fort Drum, and also he lent us a whole bunch of 10th gear from the Second World War for an exhibit we did at Hamilton College. It's quite nice to have.
Okay. Well, great. At this point, I'll turn it back to Abby. But again, thank you. I just really appreciate everything you've done.
That was my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Maurice. That was amazing. Appreciate that. And thank you, Brian, for facilitating, and Sharon for your back-end presentation work. Really grateful for all of you giving the museum your time tonight. So thank you again. And I also want to thank everybody that tuned in. Don't forget your $10 donation could win you a pair of darn tough socks. Our next Red Bench event, we have monthly events scheduled throughout the rest of the season. The next one is scheduled for September 24th, and that one will have a panel of ski industry leaders talking about how Vermont's ski areas will be open for business and ideal distancing in our current world. Registration for that will be open soon, and I hope you can join us for that as well. And that's all I have for tonight. Just a big thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And I've been seeing some of these donations roll in, and I really appreciate that as well. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.